Good morning. Let's start Heritas discussion, which is not a simple discussion. It's called Recharge the Heritage. And this is not only a discussion, but also we are opening by it the entire program of Heritas’20. It's a special festival with a special idea. And this idea goes through the whole festival and our discussion today. One of the ideas is that Heritas invites us not only to celebrate heritage, but also to change the perception and understanding of heritage. All of us here know really well what heritage is, but let's think what it really is. Aren't we looking at it through our own perspective, like the heritage administrator, heritage owner, or see only an architectural structure, but we often forget the material heritage? So Heritas Festival wants to show all the perspectives of heritage, and this idea reflects well in the program of all the 3 days. At a first glance, it might seem that there is a bit of everything there. We have discussions, education, sessions, presentations, consultations, and a fair. But it's not a coincidence. We want to show the whole diversity of heritage and make a space for different people to meet and to enable these people to meet who usually don't meet on a regular basis. And this is the platform for sharing ideas. And the discussions also a part of this, the present discussion, I mean. Our topic is recharge the heritage, and we can recharge the heritage in different ways. And in the first panel, we are going to speak about recharging the heritage with meanings. In the second part, we will speak about the employment of cultural heritage. In the third part, we are going to speak about the methodology from the communication perspective. And in the fourth part, the heritage will be approached from the perspective of heritage conflicts. And heritage can teach us, and conflicts can teach us something in recharging the heritage. In every panel, we'll have 3 panelists, and all panelists represented different areas. One of them will be a theoretician, another person would represent the administration of heritage, and the third one would be would represent the owners of heritage. And we will see whether we will find the common language. And yet another idea of Heritas Festival is fewer ceremonies and more actual work. Now I would like to give the floor to the first panel, which is called Heritage, a Renewable Resource, and it will be moderated by Matas Šiupšinskas. Good morning. As I have been introduced, I'm not going to repeat myself, and let's save time. Let's go to the point. A few words about the context. The heritage, a renewable resource. And we have some terms as interpretation and creativity that hide behind this topic. And I believe that this discussion will speak a lot about these 2 concepts, interpretation and creative approach to heritage. In principle, interpretation is the source of vitality of heritage. Until we make heritage speak, it's just the matter which doesn't say anything to us. So we need to charge heritage with meanings. So this eternal recharging of heritage with meanings is the main topic today. The renewal is not automatic. Conditions have to be provided and compromises must be sought. To what extent you can physically touch the heritage in order for it not to lose meanings. So the limits of this creative interpretation are very important. So maybe the relation among changes and stability and authenticity will be a subtopic of this discussion. Another thing which seems important and relevant to me is the perception of heritage as a resource, because a resource seems a source for exploitation, but without using it, we can't make use of it. So this is an open question, and I believe that panelists will raise a number of questions that are relevant to them, or the questions they face in practice, and this cycle of questions will expand. So I will introduce the speakers for you who don't know them. The first speaker will be architect Martynas Mankus, the Doctor of Humanities, and it is a person who is interested in modernist and postmodernist architecture. The second panelist is Mr. Darius Žakaitis, an entrepreneur, the head of TechPart and the establisher, founder of Rupert Center. And he has faced the problems of the adaptation of historical buildings for a number of times, and I saw the results. These encounters were successful. And the third panelist is Audrius Ambrasas, an architect too. We have two architects in this panel. And he's the member of the Architects' Council, the author of Swedbank building, and you saw a lot of infrastructure created by him. But the most important thing is that he is the architect who teaches students and participates in social activities. Although he does not speak a lot, but he never keeps silent when something important happens. So may I give the floor to the first panelist right away. Good morning. May I thank the organizers for the invitation to this event. The topic of my presentation is visible on the slide, but I would like to point out that my presentation expands my study, the list of valuable architectural properties of the 20th century, and starting with the post-war years up to now. And in my presentation, I will mainly speak about the architecture in the last 50 or 60 years. And in the study I've mentioned, we had two objectives, and we tried to make the inventories of the properties, and we set a set of criteria. At the end of last year, we had a small final event, the exhibition of Norbert Tukai architecture photograph, And it represented the buildings which become visible only after their renovation or after they are demolished. On the other hand, these buildings are quite prominent, bearing in mind all the architectural heritage of the second half of the 20th century. We don't have so many prominent examples with prominent functions. In post-war architecture, which has the potential to be valuable in the future, we face the quantitative aspect. If we speak about heritage as a resource, the architecture of the second half of the 20th century, we see that it is the most abundant resource. The buildings used for residential purposes accounts for 80% of the buildings of this purpose in general. The architecture of that period as part of architects' production, you see an example here. The Guardian provided the list of best buildings in the 21st century, and there are 25 objects that were created in the 21st century are listed. And the aim is to make them as representative as possible with as diverse typology as possible. So this list is rather subjective, but we see that a third of these buildings are the result of reconstruction, or the object is heritage, so to speak. Historical heritage by the 20th century, industrial heritage, or the heritage of mass construction, everyday architecture heritage, like, for instance, the gas station in London, which was converted into a cinema. It was transformed by architects themselves, like do-it-yourself. It may be said that such lists provided by newspapers are rather subjective, but I have yet another example. There is a Miss Wonderor prize for the objects of architectural objects. The foundation operating in Barcelona organizes it, and every 2 years there is a format well known for architects, and hundreds of objects are providing for these awards, and they are awarded every 2 years. And on this slide you see the example from 2017. It was the last but one award. In the 70s, the winner is the residential building constructed in the 70s of the last century, and it was reconstructed. More spaces were provided for its residents, more panoramic views, engineering solutions were offered, and you see the view before and after, and it reminds of Eastern Europe, and in Lithuania we probably don't have so big buildings. And Then we have the winner of the 2019. The winner is from the Netherlands, from the suburbs of Bimember with 50,000 residents. It's like 2 districts of Vilnius. It was the building was designed in 1970 by a state design company. And in the Netherlands, they used the parallel with the ghetto because people from previous colonies used to reside here, and one wing, one block was reconstructed, and in 2019 they were awarded for this project. So these prizes and awards suggest that the focus on the 20th century architectural heritage is greater, and it is a result of the architect's work. Another thing is the change in urban development and symbolic meanings of spaces and buildings. Here you see the objects constructed in 1944, 1953 in Vilnius. It may be said that you can see from these points where the constructions took place, so the Vokiečių street, the central part of Vilnius. So it expresses the structure of the administrative government, and the new meanings of the city were created in this way. And this is the period which is related to the architecture of social realism with the totalitarian regime. But this view changed in 10-15 years because new plans were drafted, new buildings were constructed, a new layer of buildings was placed on the city. And what we see in the city now is a different city with residential buildings, with business quarters, and these semantic, meaningful dominance change the city. So the direction to transform the old buildings is very obvious. And here we see the packing of Reichstag in 1995. 2 artists came up with this idea. It was not a political gesture. The artists avoid all political connotations, but the society probably understood the meaning behind it, and because the Reichstag is an important building in the society's life, and after it was unpacked in 2 weeks, it sort of symbolized the freeing of the nation and the merging of the nation, which was split up. Reichstag is not the building of the second half of the 20th century, but it's related to very complicated experiences. And it represents the creation of new symbols, and it can be said that it's the practice of exorcism or eviction of evil spirits. And it's exorcism by means of glass. The building was made transparent, and the main element is the glass dome, which recreates one of the ideas in the history of the building and relates it to history, and you're looking at this building not from downstairs, but you can go up and look at the work of the parliamentarians from the top.
Labai dažnai šiuo atveju taikoma to disonuojančio paveldo.
Quite often we use the concept of dissonant heritage. It means certain artifacts are witnesses of real conflicts. Therefore, in case of Lithuania, we speak about some distinctive objects. For example, bunkers, KGB offices. We don't have many examples of concentration camps, and most often it's just group monuments and nearby public spaces. And such new symbolic indications, urban indications, take place in two ways: by building new symbolic signs or by efforts to reconstruct the meanings of existing monuments. I could give a number of similar examples, and now we'll have a look at one of the recent examples, the project by Mr. Liškevičius to set up a lift near the monument of Cvirka and set up it also underground. So that's the situation about monuments. And what can we say about architecture, in particular the post-war architecture? It was imposed and also served propagandist purpose. Such meanings were fading away over time, and here you can see the National Library and the art school. Well, does it represent painful experiences? I wouldn't say so. The reason could be the cultural or neutral function of those particular buildings. Now let's look into a more politicized function, for example, the building of political education. Now the building is used by the medical library and one of the buildings of university. A person must know the context in order to be able to link the buildings with a specific period. It would be difficult to find some ideological justification or sense for those buildings. Still in Vilnius, there are many of similar elements of decor. For example, stars, some other more stylish elements. Some examples of de-cementization are successful. For example, the building of railway workers. The building was built as a hall or gathering hall of trade unions. It was decorated in a specific way which was closely linked to ideology. In 1994, the club Kablis by Novakas was set up in the building. In this way, the monument or the statue could deflate the realistic or socialist mode. Now, in terms of post-war heritage, we can find out a number of pros and cons. We should answer such questions, questions related to time, to artistic, memorial, social, technological value and sense of such heritage. Sometimes pros outweigh cons, sometimes quite the opposite. And such considerations are taken into account in deciding whether to include specific monuments into the register of cultural valuables. Have a look at the photograph of the sports palace, photograph by Tukai. It was condemned as a relic or the Soviet monster. The photograph shows the building deserved much public attention, and it speaks for itself. Thanks. Our next speaker is Darius Žakaitis.
Tai laba diena visiems.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me to speak to such people and in this event at the university. I will speak about the projects to which I could contribute. And I'd like to tell you at least something interesting. Most importantly, heritage is joy, a chance to get into contact, creation, its adaptation and engagement gives joy. And I had the chance to contribute to a number of assets, be a member of the teams which put the objects back to life. Why am I talking about joy? Heritage gives a chance for a creative look and perspective. The buildings are interesting as such. And it's a chance to pool an interesting team for shared work. Architects find it interesting to be involved in such processes, cooperate, and work in a team from interesting people from architecture and different areas. It's interesting to see how it can be used to engage a community. So I will start from my journey, the journey 10 years ago. It was the first project which I developed together with Honorable Audrius, who's with us today. I don't know if you remember, probably people of my age can remember well the grocery store in Valakampi district. When young, we would buy beer and would go to sit by the river. It was one of the most prestigious and interesting places in Vilnius. There were no chances to take the flight and to go to Turkey, but everybody could jump into a trolleybus and go to Valakampi. Eventually, we bought the facilities, the premises, and we were not sure how to use the premises. Some 10 years ago, we thought we could set up an arts center. We made use of European Union support. So I came to Audrius and said, listen, there's a chance to create something new. We had to think about new activities because the existing heritage could no longer be used. The grocery store worked for 8 years, and now the present building is very successful. Many foreign guests come. It is used by young people for exhibitions. It was our first try to use the existing building to set up a new facility. It was demolished and we built a new one. So thanks to Mr. Ambrasas, now it is a specimen of heritage of the 21st century. And it was our first step. The success and implementation of this project, as well as a new community, helped us trust ourselves and to start efforts on larger spaces for creative people. In 2015, we applied to Vilnius city for support for the tech park. And it became possible to try and transform the hospital of Sapiegos. It had been planned to remove the hospital at the end of 2015. I was born and grew up in the district of Antakalnis. I was 45 when I visited the park of Sapiegos for the first time. For 45 years, when I was a resident of Antakalnis, the area was closed. And the explanation was the closing was and isolation was necessary because of its patients. The condition of buildings was poor. Well, the repairs were only superficial and basic. The ceiling was made of plastic. No unique elements had survived in the buildings. And the buildings were genuinely just a real heritage. Quite many elements of the buildings had to be preserved and conserved. So it was a very interesting initiative. We had to find a chance to adapt the building to present-day requirements and functions. The pictures show the previous condition of the buildings. The unit and the state as such was large. Its layout and configuration was complex. It was built during the times of the Tsar as a hospital, and nobody believed creative industries will become the new users of the facilities. We had some major challenges. It wasn't difficult to transform the hospital into offices, cafes, and some other facilities, but the area didn't have any conference room or hall. The picture shows an element of the conference room. It is very elegant. It does not do any harm to the heritage. It has just been integrated as a corridor. And now this area has a conference facility which is necessary for community needs. All wooden houses have also been engaged and adapted. In my view, heritage is a joy if you take a creative approach, and heritage can be almost anything, be it a greenhouse or a wooden house. You can give second life to any facility, any asset. What am I trying to say? What matters is your attitude. The facility you see in the picture earlier had been used by a boiler house, and now it's one of the most popular pubs. The original condition of this room was so interesting, we tried to preserve it. One more interesting example in this picture. We removed the plastic ceiling, and we found old wooden slabs dating back to the Tsar times, and now we believe they can serve a modern-day function really well, and it's much better compared to the plastic suspended ceiling. The community in these areas in Valakampiai and Sapiegos Park has been growing. And we made the third step, which was closer to the city center. And the third step was the tech loft. The building had been used for warehousing in Algirdas Street. We didn't know how to use the building. The layout of the building wasn't very good. The building was not under protection. It didn't have any elements to be conserved or preserved. Just its location was significant. So everybody said we should perhaps demolish it to make the project cheaper. Just we had a walk together with the architects, and our idea was to try to preserve the building, to make use of the warehouse spirit. 20 years ago, there were efforts of reconstruction which looked strange. And we believed it was possible to come up with solutions how to merge the old and the new. Eventually, it gave a much more interesting and unique result. And it was more appealing compared to a completely new structure.
And you can see what it looks like now, how we managed to do it, to exploit the outline of the building, and all the construction was also preserved. And of course, investments were made into reinforcement and support, but we managed to bring it to the second life, and it functions properly in an excellent manner, and many people think that the facade was also preserved. The walls, the old walls were preserved. What else was interesting in this project for us? We wanted not only to adapt it and turn it into a contemporary building, but we also managed to find old elements which suited well for this project, and to use these elements as pieces of art or elements of design. So the logo of Techloft, you can see it, it's from the Žalgiris Stadium, and we managed to get it from property developers. So we used it for marking the stores of the building, and we integrated also the post boxes, so we used some authentic elements. And these elements decorate the building and create the atmosphere, and everything goes well. So, apart from these three public buildings, I worked with a house in Užupis Street. It probably was the longest project. It lasted for 13 years. From the moment of purchasing and settling in. There were a lot of ideas and a lot of creative ideas. It used to be a house in Užupis like this, and we should speak about the joy of discovery here. We bought a house in a nice location, a very plain house. When we started digging deeper, it turned out it used to be a prayer house, a Jewish synagogue. Everything should be preserved and conserved. When we took away the ceiling, we found a lot of authentic elements. Now this house looks like this, more or less, and you see several elements of walls. The walls were restored, they were destroyed greatly, so we tried to preserve certain elements. And you can see new elements integrated, and its condition was rather bad, and during the war it was a shell or a bomb hit it in the very middle, and it was destroyed greatly, and people lived there for 50 years and destroyed it further. But irrespective of that, certain elements were integrated and preserved, and they create an interesting composition. Matas allowed me, as an entrepreneur, not to know some things. and to raise questions and look for answers. So I tried to raise a few questions for myself. For instance, whether exploitation of heritage and its reinterpretation creates value, what are the differences in costs, and whether clients are inclined to pay more for the possibility to use heritage. So we tried to look for the answers to these questions in literature available, in the studies available, and so on. In fact, few discussions take place in this area. The costs of new construction and reconstruction are unfavorable for heritage. It's much more expensive to work with heritage, and it takes longer to reconstruct it. You are limited in time. You are under a lot of restrictions and requirements, and it costs more. And the answer to this question is quite obvious. Does it create value, and whether people are inclined to use heritage? In my opinion, only thanks to this conference I started thinking about it, and I believe that it creates value. And it creates value for us in the first place because it's worth doing it. It's an opportunity to do something very creative. Our clients inclined to pay more for this because it's inevitable to employ heritage, because it has to pay off, because you have to pay back your loans to the bank, you have to pay salaries to your staff. And in our case, I can't say that we receive more income from such projects than from regular new construction. But in the long term, we will win. Because some corners of Vilnius are made more beautiful. And it also would be very interesting in our panel, to discuss in our panel, what's missing, what's lacking, and what could help us. We see that a lot has been demolished, a lot of good things have been demolished. When you don't stop, don't prohibit, don't prevent, don't follow your common sense, when you don't manage these processes properly, what should be done to boost entrepreneurs' willingness to work with such projects? Because you can't earn a lot more from them. And the authorities, the government, public institutions have to realize that property developers, the managers of heritage properties, they do a good job and they should be assisted with all possible means for them to continue this endeavor. Demolishing is the easiest way out. You demolish to construct something new and earn even more. And another important question for me is what heritage is. So the scoreboard of Žalgiris Stadium is a very good example. It was not preserved. It took us 2 years to buy these bulbs from them, and we wanted to buy that nice clock, metal clock. We wanted to preserve all of it and buy it, but unfortunately we failed. So it would be wise to expand the function of heritage and not to waste interesting and good things, and to have a possibility to preserve them and adapt them and allow them to live their second life. So this is it. That's all what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm glad that we have more and more questions for our discussion. And now may I give the floor to the last speaker, Audrius Ambrasas. Hello. Matas told me that I don't have to speak too long because you can't place a plate and explain why you do this, and people see them and assess, evaluate them intuitively. The title of my presentation is Power of Heritage. Maybe you will see from my presentation where it is. But I would like to introduce one project where I participated. The conversion of Paupys quarter, and the part we did has been completed, and it was interesting for me myself to compile all the material which covers the last decade and to see the evolution of this project. You see the territory, what it looked like earlier. It covered the territory of 5 hectares. And I started working with this project around 10 years ago in this building, and this building was a factory of locks. And in the building of this factory, 4 architects, my colleagues Rolandas Palikas, Henrikas Štaude, and Mr. Parveneckas, met in creative workshop, and they spent several months in dealing with our clients and thinking how can we convert the territory. The clients try to explain what they think about it and what should be done, and we allowed them to cut some elements and try to do it. We also worked with the colleagues, discussed these plans, walked around this quarter, and we provided an emotional proposal of this conversion. We wanted to reflect this environment and include into the fabric of the old town of Vilnius, because it was separated from the old town for 50 years. And we introduced the final solution to the investors. And the main parameters, altitudes of this territory and the character, were reflected in the detail plan. There was a break, and then after some time the investors came back and asked us to review the design and to come up with a more pragmatic and rational proposal. So this is a sketch made by us, and we were offered to design this territory. Municipality with Mindaugas Pakalnis also cooperated, and they divided this territory into quarters. We had 6 teams of architects. Each of them received a part of this territory, and they had some guidelines what they should do. They chose this territory from our sketch, and we received this part of the project. The buildings that should be retained are marked in red. The post-war block of the factory, we have the factory of locks as well. It is historical, and a small cottage. It was marked as a dot, and I will tell about it later. And the most important thing, which is heritage and which has to be preserved, it is the distribution point of electricity and power, so it had to be preserved. So these were the main guidelines for us. We had a sort of a green corridor, a passage, and then we came up with an idea to have a compositional axis from this small cottage to the factory of locks. And we had a layout, produced a layout, and different architects worked with different quarters. We had produced a model of this quarter, and the cottage was related to activist Dzerzhinsky, and the museum used to be there, but at the end of the project, this cottage burned, and we offered to build something new, which reminded of the buildings of the beginning of the 20th century. And we had to preserve the block of the factory and reconstruct and adapt it to offices, and the rest had to be used for the residential purposes. Again, we had a slight break, and after some time I saw that nothing is happening in this territory. And when they were cleaning the territory, the buildings were also cleaned and demolished. So the buildings that had to be preserved were not preserved, and 4 years ago, when the main element disappeared, and we had to choose what to do, to look for new solutions or to continue the initial idea. So we stayed with the initial idea. The residential part was taken away, and we worked only with commercial buildings, and an interesting transformation took place, because the buildings that should have been used for the residential purposes were sort of converted into offices. The courtyard was also rearranged. It had a slight cultural purpose. Attempts were made to separate it from the neighboring quarter, but we still provided it with a passage, with a link to the neighboring quarter. And in the long run, the use for the building appeared, the Pasaka cinema. It had this sort of fairy tale atmosphere, and it was nice that the cinema started operating here. There is a hall here, and we had to make an evacuation exit. So we have sort of a sleeve attached to this building. So if I go back to the topic of my presentation, the power of heritage, I can say that you can deal with the problems, you can fight them like with wind mills, but you can also use them for implementation of new ideas. You can see this cottage, the way it used to look like, and the current one. And Sometimes you may ask yourselves why you have this wooden building in this street surrounded by office buildings, but the answer is there used to be a wooden cottage here and we constructed another wooden cottage.
Toks punktyrinis.
The street's mood was very important. As I said, energy facilities form an important part of Vilnius. So here we have this electricity distribution unit. We had to leave it intact, and we really were respectful about this building, and we had to persuade the client and the contractor. It was necessary to put some plaster on the brickwork. So negotiations took a long time, and as soon as we finished and the brickwork was painted, it added some uniform, the same color for the building, but the old brickwork was separated by a silver color frame. We tried to preserve the unique forms of structures of this suburb of Vilnius. A change in heights was quite remarkable, and it was used for two-level car park. The same, this apartment block looked like this. We had one connecting building, like a connecting axle. We were happy we came up with such a connector between the streets. It opened up beautiful landscapes to Subačius hills. We also used such elevation of 6%. The residents said they preferred just the staircase. Just in real life, this elevation is used by both pedestrians and cyclists. And this really smoothens the transition between different heights. Water pools and fountains are quite trendy, and our client was willing to have it. The fountain represents and shows a new approach. The water runs from an old faucet. That's the picture from history. Architects are often accused for not being able to render beautiful visualizations into life. A function is most important, and developers treated the function very creatively. They followed the architectural solutions very precisely, and they engaged all the buildings in a proper way. You can see the restaurant, the cinema, the covered marketplace. And the biggest value and the biggest focus was on spaces. Our intention was to form cozy spaces. Buildings, materials, and lights all serve the same purpose. You can see some green areas, connecting elements.
Erdvės visada labai malonu padaryti tas erdvės tokias tarpines tarp vidaus ir lauko, kur
It's very pleasant to set up some intermediary spaces under the roof or outdoors.
na ir grįžtant prie to korpuso, kuris buvo nugriautas, kuris prieš tai galvota, kad
Now, in terms of the old block which had been destroyed, I should say it had no value as such. It wasn't just a historical building. It was built around 1950. It was made of simple bricks. It was just an industrial building, as many other in Vilnius, and we gave a new life to it.
paveldu taip eksperimentuoti negalėtų.
Well, it wouldn't be possible to experiment like this
Paveldas, tai mes su juo taip laisvai gan
with valuable cultural assets. But we had some freedom, and it was our interpretation.
Paupio gatve, o čia tas kampas buvusio pastato.
You see the corner of the former building. Before,
Taip atrodė pirmieji eskizai, kaip mes įbandėm
the first sketches when we tried to suggest our reconstruction ideas. You see the connecting unit, the hall. The windows were just made longer. Some
jo nebeliko,
openings were cut out.
kaip ir ranka nekyla, nes
Just simple rebuilding wasn't an option.
mes čia sau leidom tokį padaryti kaladėlių žaidimą,
So we allowed ourselves to kind of play,
bet lyg kažkas kitaip.
to form and build as if anew.
Jis atrodo ir būtent preciziškai sudėtas iš kaladėlių, nes jeigu įsivaizduot, mes jį pradėtume čia
We used appropriate finishing materials, and now the building looks as if it has been formed out of wooden blocks.
paveldo nuotaiką, tą dežavų, kad
Our intention was to preserve the heritage spirit or déjà vu.
kirtimas pakibęs ir tas prakirtimas su
You see, this is suspended opening. It cuts the building into two pieces and merges into the environment.
paveldo, reiškia, institucijos nereikalavo šlaitinių stogų visur.
Our authorities did not insist on sloping roofs,
Holė taip pat praeina
and it freed us up.
namas, išeina į kitą.
You can see similar finishing touches in the facade and indoors. Now, in terms of the architecture of the building, I should say, I mentioned the blocks.
Galbūt bandėm tą
Have a look at the previous picture. Our intention was to keep the same distance and the spirit instead of rebuilding literally.
uždarą teritoriją,
It was important to link the closed area with the environment. And it's the present day look. The wall is the limit of the old town, which is protected by heritage protection regulations. So our experimentation took place in the area of the old town, which is protected by UNESCO. That's the picture on the other side of the wall.
nauja, nesena, bet šiek tiek keista tokia.
It looks new and kind of strange.
Dieviai nesimatytų, reiškia, taip urbanistiniam tam modelyje.
A new architecture should not be too prominent.
Bažnyčių bokštai kyšo panoramos minkštos tokios.
The cityscape is predominated by church towers.
Pastatą šiek tiek pažeminam, bet
Therefore, we had to make the new building slightly lower.
ir jis net šiek tiek labiau įtūtas gavosi į tą aplinką.
And now it is as if nestled
Fasadas iš viršaus, jisai toks
in the environment.
šlaitiniai stogai, kai kur
In some places you can see sloping roofs,
terasom paversti, tai čia va tas vaizdas.
somewhere else the roofs were turned into terraces.
Smoloto stogo čia užlipus su investuotojais, tai jiem ten širdis salo sakė, o čia dar gal vieną aukštą galim pakelti.
The investors really liked the view from the roof and were eager to invest, but we could defend our idea and resist the pressure.
Vaizdas liko
And now
naudojama.
the building opens beautiful landscapes, the terrace can be used.
Atsiveria vaizdai. Tai Vilniuje, kaip žinot, tie aplamai vaizdas turbūt vertingiausias yra dalykas senamiesty.
Actually, the view is the most valuable element, which raises most discussions and which really costs. If you have a good view from your window, you pay more. And normally there's much public debate because of the view.
Tiesiog į kitą vaizdą.
Now let me show one more picture, the opposite side of it.
Čia pademonstruosiu tą paveldo galę, kaip jinai
The power of heritage, how it can be directly reflected. Some 5 years ago,
buvo projektavom pastatą, tokie projektiniai pasiūlymai padaryti tiek mūsų, tiek čia.
we made some design offers.
Bet kilo toks ažiotažas ir buvo vat štai šis vaizdas vinklintas, kad tai yra
And the view was considered to be a monument.
ar ne taip, bet va taip turi būti.
It was discussed whether the view should be preserved or whether it can be changed.
Žygimantų gatvės perimetro pratesimą.
And the original idea was the extension of the Algimantas of the street perimeter.
Mes visą tą pažeminam tą dalį, pabandėm ten
We take heritage protection requirements into account. That's why the height of our building was decreased. Now the picture looks like this. We publicized our solutions. Our colleagues
mes sakėm, norim, kad čia to namo kaip ir nebūtų.
were very critical. We said we wouldn't like to see the building in this place. And nobody agreed.
Bandėm tą,
So let's go to the same picture again. We tried to solve the puzzle.
žiūrėjom, dar įdėmiau ir kilo tokia
If you are more attentive, you can design such a building.
bokštai, kurie matosi.
Now it really fits into the view. It shows all the towers.
Pakankamai padoriai pasikabintų
Now it is smaller.
karnizus, na, turėtų tokio iškilmingumo, reiškia,
It looks quite pompous and at the same time unexpected.
šis variantas suderinti, nežinau,
So we are trying to get approval for this particular solution, and it is intriguing.
kolte, reiškia, nuleisti. Tai apie tą paveldo galę aš sakyčiau, kad
As far as the power of heritage is concerned, I would say it is like gravitation or wind force. You cannot fight it, you can just utilize it for your own purposes.
Tai dėkui visiems pašnekovam.
Thanks to all the panelists for such interesting presentations. Now, coming back to the last example, it shows well how compromises are necessary in terms of heritage. But compromises should not be templates.
Nei vienai pusėje, bet tokie kūrybingi ir
The middle road should be chosen and creative approach is necessary.
Tai, manau, gerai iliustruoja čia vieną iš problemų, su kuria
It illustrates well one of the problems we encounter. In case you have any questions, just raise your hands or give some other signs. We try to engage you or involve you into our discussion. Now, I'd like to ask my colleagues if they are willing to exchange some comments. I'd like to share some thoughts about all presentations. So I'd like to ask
This is Vilnius nuotraukomis vienas.
Darius, you started your presentation from pictures. The first was of the palace of Sapiegos, and the second was of the sports palace or sports building. You were willing to preserve the artifacts of the past. And it cannot be done very easily. Quite many efforts and energy should be put into it. So, where does your motivation come from for such initiatives? So, where do you get the drive for preservation of such elements?
Verslininkas iš tikrųjų.
Probably I'm not a genuine businessman.
Turbūt kažkoks, kūrybinių idėjų, tos kūrybinės idėjos, jos įdomu kažką kūrybiškai nuveikti.
Creative ideas are very interesting. They give joy and energy.
Saugoti tablo nebuvo mano.
The idea to preserve wasn't mine. It belonged to our architects. And the thought behind it was quite different. The board itself, as it was originally thought, had to be in the park of Sapiegos. It had to feature different information about Vilnius and join together heritage and technologies. The city authorities didn't want to see any information boards in this location. And it's an interesting story. The procurement procedure had lasted for 2 years, and later we could not use it for any purpose. So the drive is not logical. It's just an adventure. It's just a road and joy.
Logotipų ir visai tai, kažkaip iškabai tai idealiai tinkantis dalykas, bet kai mes pradėjom tą daryti, tikrai nežinom, pabaigsim.
In the original phase, we were not sure of the final result. Or a creation is a way of life, and your efforts get meaning.
Jūs minėjote irgi prezentacijai, kad finansinė prasme lyg ir
You mentioned in your presentation that the users of your facilities are not willing to pay more, and it sounds quite a paradox. Some authors write about the creative class. Some jobs cannot be automated or robotized.
kūrybinga ta kūrėjų klasė iš esmės nelabai yra linkę
And creators, as a society strata, are not willing to work in conventional office spaces. They look for some distinction. So maybe artifacts
galbūt ir bus reikalingos, jeigu ne
also contributes to stories or legends.
Taip, bet supraskit, kad aš su to sutinku, kad
Yes, I agree.
tie žmonės kūrybingi ir inovatyvūs
Creative and innovative young persons are looking for different spaces, but such clients are not the best paying clients. We get most money from banks or those authorities or some authorities. We can't earn most money compared to the market average. But we generate added value for ourselves and people. And we believe it will get converted or translated into a benefit. When we worked on Valakampi project, we could not guess we would get one more and much more extensive project. So we just made the second step, and eventually it led us to others. I believe everybody must make his or her choices. It would be strange if everybody, all developers, would follow just one line, if everybody just focused on conservation or started building glass buildings. The city would become monotonous. Just it was the choice and road traveled by our team. And it's difficult to explain how it turned out like this. Somebody said if you can just skip building, don't build. And it seems it's not yet the time for us to undertake any new construction.
It seems that the newer the heritage, the more legends about it are required. For example, Martynas spoke about the heritage from the second half of the 20th century, and it's probably often very hard to convince someone that something should be preserved. For example, the Palace of Sport is a good example, and all of a sudden, from a concrete monster, it becomes a preserved object. Maybe Martynas knows more how these narratives should appear. You spoke about exorcism, who should carry it out? The Tsarist heritage, for example. It seems that this exorcism already took place. And we don't say that the Tsarist architecture should be demolished, although it also was not a very good regime that ruled the country. So how this narrative should be created? Or who should do it? I don't really know. Maybe we ourselves, because every generation develops its own approach to heritage, and I'm most interested in Vilnius history. And every generation has an approach to it. For example, there are memoirs where the current railway station building is something terrible and which distorts this beautiful city Vilnius. And it's a good example that approaches change and the political governments also change. So I believe that the most of the heritage dating back to the second half of the 20th century does not need this exorcism. Maybe the question may be raised whether the Soviet districts should be demolished, but it's hard to tell if people feel such strong feelings towards that era. They would probably demolish these buildings and you won't be able to do anything against it. I would like to point out one thing. When we look at the examples of adapting heritage, it seems that we have some space for heritage protection entrepreneurship. The heritage protection system operates perfectly, more or less, but employment of these new buildings, reconstructed buildings, and the asset bank probably is the institution in charge of selling and distribution of these assets. It would be nice that an intermediary institution appears which offers for sale a certain package of heritage, including its adaptation. I once was in the former headquarters of Bank Heritas. It's still not used. And as far as I understand, property developers rejected it, decided to demolish it. Later on, they received scenarios that they can do something else, and perhaps they will move from the skeptical approach to the approach that if you can refrain from demolishing, so please don't demolish. And the question to Audrius. It's hard for the architect to build something because they have to design something. But there are places which seem should better remain untouched. It's hard for me to imagine, but I feel that there are places that should be left in peace, that don't need any change. Maybe no people should be or tourists attracted to them. Maybe their spirit is this calm existence. Have you ever found such a place, not necessarily a piece of architectural heritage? I will tell you, but you probably won't like it. Martynas mentioned that maybe should refrain from demolishing, but the former palace of trade unions on Taurus Hill was demolished. And nothing should be constructed there, a perfect panoramic view, a nice space, a square. So sometimes it's better not to construct. You are right. I didn't mean that. But a good example. I have a lot of questions, but maybe we have questions from the audience or from the audience online. Do we have any? A comment, an observation? I wanted to ask, we are not from Vilnius, we are from a different town. In smaller towns, there are territories that are not covered with buildings, and new property developers come and they want to construct new buildings there, A-class buildings, but there are a number of old buildings which are not used. And the town becomes half-life because there are a lot of old buildings which are not used and they are not adapted. New spaces are covered up, and we have sort of these buildings like ghosts. I heard that abroad there are municipalities which adapt existing buildings and later on build new buildings in the unbuilt territories. What do you think about this approach? Can we answer the question? We have a problem with this post-war heritage. I mean, its condition. Sometimes it's not preservable. If we compare it to Germany, for example, they have industrial heritage, or if we go to Klaipėda region, you have actually, you don't have to do anything there, you just have to clean it up. And this post-war architecture is not built in a quality manner. And my practical observation, yes, of course, it's good to refurbish the buildings that should be refurbished and only construct new buildings later on. The majority of states, the Netherlands, for example, they don't stop building. And, for example, the municipalities move to other buildings, they come up with new requirements and they move into other buildings. But the aim of our discussion probably is to crystallize the values. And first of all, I think it's this building should bear a certain social, societal value. And if people have a sentiment towards that building, a lot depends on the interpretation of the value of that building. And if the condition is bad and there are no properties of value, it's hard to prohibit such processes, most likely. And culturally, perhaps, for example, this change in Japan is part of their identity. Their buildings have these cycles, undergo their cycles very fast. And if we look at Lithuanian towns, architects are sort of cannibals in their activities because they have to rediscover themselves to offer something new, something more impressive. And if a town does not expand a lot, we must realize that it's limited in space. And if you design a new district, you make a decision and you sort of sacrifice a certain space. You can't avoid it, of course, but we shouldn't ignore what's happening. And we shouldn't pretend that this is not happening, and we should plan better. Because very often when we create something new and something beautiful, we destroy something good in another part of the town. Any more questions from the audience? In fact, I would like to go back to the topic of our panel, a heritage, a renewable resource. In fact, the first panelist spoke about the analysis, and when we do analysis of the things that is not heritage today, but that can be heritage in the future. So we had the gas factory, the Jewish cemetery, the Opera and Ballet Theatre, or the Palace of Congresses. They destroy something that was prior to them. Is it just this superficial denial that it's a Soviet heritage? But this denial should take place at this professional level, that this heritage was built by destroying historical heritage. And I don't believe that heritage is a renewable resource. If you destroy it, you construct something that maybe will be heritage in the future. What I want to say is that the majority of people were impressed by the architecture shown by Mr. Ambrasas. It's high-level architecture. But the fact that the house of one of the most notorious sadists in Europe burned and something new was built on it. So you won't be able to come to this place and see where this terrible person was maturing. And we spoke about heritage that renews for a couple of hours already, but it does not renew, it's destroyed, I believe. My brief comment, you touched upon a very interesting topic. I would say that it is a layering of historical layers. When we construct something, we, of course, modify something. If we don't speak about the historical part of the city where there's historical layer, where there are a lot of historical layers, if we speak about the suburbs, Lazdynai district, for example, which was constructed, which replaced a small village, and it was not constructed in a natural environment, but in the place where something already existed. Of course, natural environment can be heritage as well. I would go back to the topic of the values of these physical structures and what do they mean to us. Perhaps this new quality may be better for us subjectively than the previous one. But I would like to point out that when we speak about the objects pertaining to the second half of the 20th century, and it is not heritage, it's potential heritage. And I've analyzed the number of objects, and I looked into the register of immovable property register, and a lot of properties are overlaid with historical layers. For example, the central post office building designed by architect Žakaitis. Maybe architects see it as an example of architecture, but we see that it is the case of several layers. And it's hard to tell whether this new building sort of demolished the previous building or pointed out its positive features. And in my opinion, it is an example of positive integration. We have to analyze each case separately, but of course, the majority of buildings appear in the place of the old buildings. And of course, we should speak about values here and about the approach that was prevalent in that period of time. Riga, for example, positions itself as the capital of Art Deco, local capital of Art Deco. All the buildings built there replaced wooden buildings. And now we have the view with beautiful 6- and 5-story buildings close to wooden cottages. And Latvia also deals with the issue, what is heritage? Of course, there are owners of buildings who didn't manage to build the sign of the new era. So now we are in the situation which should be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. But we can't state that all new buildings deny the previous objects built is not good. I wouldn't dare state so, and maybe Audrius would comment more on it. I wouldn't speak about a very specific building, but I remembered a discussion about the Radzivill Palace and the creation of the museum there, organized by Arūnas Gilūnas, and it was attended by Motiejus Radvila, the Duke. And he said that the whole history of Poland and Lithuania is the history of reconstruction. They underwent a lot of wars, reconstructed palaces and manors. They were destroyed and reconstructed again. And if the Radzivill Palace was demolished 100 years ago, they would not have been reconstructed it. They would have constructed it the way they understood it. They would have constructed it anew. And he said that it's not purposeful to rebuild the way the building was, but you have to build anew. Our panel is approaching to its end, and as to heritage as a renewable resource, we have the example where heritage is, a lot of examples where heritage is reconstructed anew, and the purpose of the buildings change, and such quarters like Paupys would probably also be a valued object. Darius in his presentation asked what heritage is. Maybe you can briefly say where is the boundary, when we should treat the object more delicately, so to speak. Every time I have to answer this question, I find new answers to it. For example, these residential buildings in Lazdynai seem hard to be adapted, and it's hard for me to imagine the adaptation of these Soviet buildings to something. So if you have high ceilings, these are the properties that look like heritage to me, but I wouldn't be able to adapt these this Soviet architecture. You have to think hard to do this and use common sense, and you have to be creative about it. I would answer this question briefly. I think heritage is something that stirs emotion, sentiments. I don't know whether I should expand here. If we see a value in it, it depends on the perceiver, because there is no heritage which is understood as a value automatically. If it stirs sentiment, it encourages people to protect it. They said it very well. It's like a quiz. You never know what the consequences will be and what should be protected. I'm not speaking about institutional heritage where it's written what should be protected and so on. You can come up with very interesting discoveries, so you have to make choices. Thank you very much. May I wish you caution and creativity.